Well, let's talk about these latest numbers and bring into the program right now David Coletto. You see him right there, founder and CEO of Abacus Data. David, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Good to see you.
Nice seeing you too. So listen, when I look at these numbers, not a lot of movement in the national numbers that you released over the weekend. So what does that tell us about the GST holiday brought in by the Liberals, fought for by the NDP? Does that mean to say that when you look at these numbers not moving, that Canadians are just not impressed by the policy?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at it. One is they haven't yet experienced it, so let's wait to see what happens when they do get that break, when they buy a number of new products that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But I think more likely is, yeah, they're not really, reacting positively to it. Not because they don't believe they need a break or that they won't welcome it, but because it's not going to change their fundamental views of the government and of the Prime Minister, which, for the last year now have signaled to us enough people are typically unhappy, and the result is a big conservative lead in the polls that we see.
Yeah, so not the big idea that might change stalled numbers, as you say, which we'll get to in a moment. But what I also found interesting when I was going through these polling numbers was that where there has been movement, it has to do with Donald Trump, in that there are more Canadians that you spoke to who seem to have a more favorable impression of the once and now incoming president than there were before, and that's even after his tariff threat. What's happening there?
It kind of confounding, right? Like, I agree with you. It's like he threatens to put a 25% tariff on our country that would greatly disrupt the economy and people's lives. And yet more Canadians today say they have a positive view of him than they did a few weeks ago. Now, he's still deeply unpopular. So let's be very clear that Donald Trump, would not win an election in Canada. But that slight rise in that green chart shows that, it had been flat for a long time, and that he's been in the news a lot. You had the Prime Minister go and visit him down at Mar-a-Lago, and the result is a slightly higher favorable. Just one other thing on this, like, more Canadians have a positive view of Donald Trump than they do of Justin Trudeau. And so that is the dynamic now that the Prime Minister finds himself in. And, Donald Trump's not going to be a popular figure in Canada, but he's not as unpopular as he used to be, which I think is an interesting dynamic.
Okay, not as unpopular as he used to be, more popular than the Prime Minister. So talk to us about the impact that you think Donald Trump may actually have on political parties on this side of the border then.
Well, I think the big question is that a lot of Canadians are increasingly asking is who's best to handle this, right? And right now, the Prime Minister and the current government are trying to deal with it, and they will have to in those first few weeks, months. We'll see when the next election comes of that Trump administration. But what we've noticed in our tracking is more Canadians today than even a few weeks ago said that Donald Trump was one of the biggest issues facing the country. Now, that's still only 1 in 5 Canadians, so it's nowhere near the same level as housing or healthcare or the cost of living. But to me, that's something we need to watch, because if that number starts to rise, it's one of the issues the Liberals actually do better on than anything else. And so if that becomes the prevailing ballot box question, it could mean that the Liberals have something they can talk to Canadians about that isn't related to the microeconomic concerns that they have. But even then, it's got to rise quite high. So Donald Trump, like a lot of other things, is disrupting Canadian politics. But so far, it hasn't changed anything about how people are feeling about the choices today. Okay,
you talk about people feeling about choices. Let's talk about favorability ratings of the party leaders. Talk to us about where things stand right now. As you said, Justin Trudeau polling worse than Donald Trump is right now.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister's really struggled to move his numbers at all. I mean, they haven't changed now for a number of weeks. His net favorables is minus 38, as you can see on the screen there, far, far lower than Jagmeet Singh, who's minus 8, and Pierre Poilievre, who finds himself as one of the only federal leaders. Mr. Blanchet in Quebec has a net favorable in Quebec. To have that position where more Canadians have a positive or negative view. I mean, it's worth saying none of these leaders are deeply popular, but you can see the huge gap between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition that I think has really defined a lot of our politics and how we view these leaders as potential prime ministers, and in the case of the current one, how he's doing in his job today.
Yeah, you mentioned Quebec, which is good because we're running out of time, but I do want to talk about Quebec because it was interesting to note that, traditionally, or has been, I guess, for at least 20, 30 years now, this battle between the Bloc Québécois and the Liberals. But now you look at these numbers, and Conservatives are leading Liberals, both behind the Bloc Québécois, but the Conservatives now leading Liberals in Quebec. What does that mean for the kind of impact it would have when an election comes on the federal parliament?
Well, if these kind of numbers hold, it first means that a lot of Liberals that maybe thought they were safe a few months ago, even on the island of Montreal, may not be. I don't think the Conservatives are going to win a lot of seats in Montreal, but it means like a riding like we saw in the by-election in Montreal could go to the Bloc, or the NDP could be competitive. And so it makes it far less predictable, but it also gives Conservatives some hope that they might be able to even pick up some seats in Quebec. So I think the big takeaway is, a Liberal is now looking increasingly like an endangered species anywhere in the country. There's no one part of the country they can definitely count on. And Quebec, while not riding the blue wave like other parts of the country, might be in some parts of that province looking at the Conservatives with maybe more open mind than they did just a few months ago.
Well, certainly Pierre Poilievre has been very concerted on trying to attract Quebec voters since the Conservative Convention way back when, but really interesting to watch all this. David, thank you for this. Appreciate the numbers and the insight.
Thanks, Michael. Take care.
You too. David Coletto of Abacus Data.